Thank you for being here. Grab a warm glass of water, sit down, and listen as I tell you the whole story. You never really know how much your life is worth until someone puts a price tag on it. For some people, human life is priceless. For my father, my life was worth exactly the price of a first-class ticket to Paris and a few nights in a luxury hotel. I was 29 years old, lying in a hospital bed at St. Catherine's, the very hospital where I worked as an emergency medical technician. I was trapped in the dark void of a medically induced coma. My brain was swelling against my skull. 4 of my ribs were shattered, and my internal organs were bleeding out from a catastrophic car crash. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. But my colleagues, the people I ate lunch with in the break room, were fighting desperately to keep my heart beating. Dr. Aris, a trauma surgeon I respected immensely, stood outside my glass door. My father, Gerald, stood across from him. He didn't look through the glass. He didn't ask if I was in pain. He didn't ask what my chances of recovery were. He asked one question, his voice as flat and unbothered as if he were asking a mechanic about a broken transmission. How much is this going to cost? Dr. Aris explained the severity of my traumatic brain injury. He explained that I needed an immediate secondary craniotomy to relieve the pressure, followed by weeks in the ICU. He gave an estimate, $240,000. My father didn't flinch. He didn't break down in tears. He simply shook his head, pulled a pen from his breast pocket, and looked Dr. Aris dead in the eye. "Let him go," my father said. "We won't pay for the surgery. His heart has been defective since he was a kid anyway. Luke needs that money for Paris. He already booked the flights." And right there, on a Tuesday night at 11:08 p.m., my father signed a do not resuscitate order. He signed my death warrant. He authorized the hospital to let me choke on my own blood, to let my organs shut down one by one, because saving my life would inconvenience his golden child's European vacation. The nurses at the station froze. Dr. Aris stared at the clipboard in his hands, his jaw tight, a vein pulsing hard at his temple. But legally, as my next of kin, my father had the power to make that call. Gerald handed the clipboard back, buttoned his coat, and walked down the hallway. He didn't go to the chapel to pray. He didn't sit in the waiting room and cry. He walked toward the elevator, pulled out his cell phone, and made a call. Paul, the head nurse on my floor and a good friend of mine, happened to be walking out of the supply closet just a few feet away. He heard every single word of my father's conversation. "Eleanor, it's done," my father said into the phone, speaking to my mother. "I signed the papers. The hospital won't touch the funds. Tell Luke his Paris trip is safe. The mortgage money stays in the account. I'll be home in 20. That was how my story almost ended. A disposable son, tossed into the incinerator so a spoiled older brother could eat croissants under the Eiffel Tower. They thought I was going to quietly fade away into the sterile white noise of the ICU. They thought the machines would stop. They would hold a modest funeral, shed a few fake tears, and board their international flight. But I didn't die that night. I woke up, and when I learned the truth about what happened while I was unconscious, I didn't scream. I didn't call them crying. I orchestrated a systematic, brutal dismantling of my father's entire life. I took everything he valued. His money, his reputation, his pride, his home. I left him with absolutely nothing. To understand how a father could look at his dying son and choose a vacation over a heartbeat, you have to understand the sick, twisted dynamic I grew up in. You have to understand that my father didn't suddenly become a monster in that hospital hallway. He had been one my entire life. That night was just the climax of 29 years of being treated like a bad investment. Let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you exactly why my father hated me, and how a house on Elm Street became the weapon that ultimately destroyed him. I was born with a target on my chest. Literally. It's a thick, jagged surgical scar running straight down my sternum, a permanent reminder of the congenital heart defect I was born with. When I was 4 years old, my heart was failing. The doctors told my parents I needed open-heart surgery to patch a massive hole between my ventricles, or I wouldn't live to see kindergarten. They did the surgery. I lived, but the hospital bill came out to over $200,000. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket costs hit my family hard. And my father, a man who measured a person's worth strictly by their financial output, never let me forget it. My earliest memory isn't playing catch in the yard or reading bedtime stories. My earliest memory is sitting at the kitchen table, swinging my legs, while my father stared at a mountain of manila envelopes stamped with hospital logos. He held a calculator in one hand and a cheap beer in the other. He looked up from the numbers, his eyes cold, locking onto my small, terrified face. "You know how much you cost this family, Matthew?" he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You're a drain. A walking, talking debt." I was 6 years old when he first said that. I didn't fully understand what debt meant, but I understood the heavy, suffocating blanket of guilt he threw over me. From that day on, I internalized the idea that my existence was a burden. Every time I asked for a new pair of sneakers because my toes were poking through the canvas, he would sigh loudly and mention the hospital bills. Every time I wanted to join a school field trip, he would shake his head and tell me I had already taken enough from the family pot. By the time I was 12, I stopped asking for anything. I wore my older brother's oversized hand-me-downs, ignoring the mockery from kids at school. I taped the soles of my shoes together. I taught myself how to sew patches onto my jeans. When I turned 15, I realized the only way to survive in that house was to become entirely self-sufficient. I started mowing lawns for the neighbors. I shoveled driveways in the dead of winter until my fingers were blue and blistered. I worked at a local diner washing dishes until midnight, breathing in grease and bleach, just so I could buy my own school supplies and cheap groceries. I wanted to be invisible. I wanted to cost them absolutely $0, hoping that maybe, just maybe, if I didn't cost anything, my father would look at me with something other than disgust. It didn't work. The resentment was baked into his bones. He looked at me and saw a negative bank balance. But he didn't look at everyone that way. The contrast in our house was blinding. While I was scraping grease off diner plates to buy a geometry textbook, my older brother Luke was living a life of absolute luxury. Luke was 3 years older than me, perfectly healthy, tall, athletic, and the absolute center of my parents' universe. Luke was the golden child. He could do no wrong. If I dropped a glass in the kitchen, I was screamed at for wasting money. If Luke wrecked the family sedan by driving drunk into a mailbox, my mother, Eleanor, would rush to hug him, crying, "Oh, my poor baby, are you hurt? The car doesn't matter, we'll fix it." Eleanor was the quiet architect of my misery. She played the role of the soft-spoken, loving mother in public, but behind closed doors, she was the one pulling the strings. She justified every terrible thing my father did to me by framing it around Luke's needs. "Try to understand, Matthew," she would say, her voice dripping with fake sympathy while she filed her nails. "Your brother is going to do great things. He needs a solid foundation. Well, we already spent so much keeping you alive. You need to be independent." Being independent meant I was entirely on my own. When I graduated high school, there was no celebration. There was no college fund for me. I wanted to become an emergency medical technician. I wanted to work in medicine, to be the person who rode in the back of the ambulance and saved lives, maybe to pay back the universe for the doctors who saved mine. I had to take out crushing student loans at 18 just to afford the certification program. I signed those promissory notes with a shaking hand, knowing that if I failed, there was no safety net waiting for me. While I was drowning in student debt and working graveyard shifts to cover my rent, Luke's life was a completely different reality. On Luke's 18th birthday, I walked out of the house to go to my dishwashing shift and saw a cherry-red Porsche 911 Carrera sitting in the driveway. A massive silver bow was tied to the roof. My father was taking photos of Luke posing against the hood, while my mother clapped her hands in delight. I stood on the porch, holding my ragged backpack, staring at a car that cost more than my entire medical debt combined. "He needs a reliable vehicle for college," my father had barked at me when he noticed me staring. "He's going to a top-tier business school. He needs to project success." Not that you would understand anything about that. They paid for Luke's entire university tuition in cash. They paid his rent for a luxury off-campus apartment. They paid for his fraternity dues, his spring break trips to Cancun, and his endless stream of designer clothes. Luke never worked a day in his life. He coasted through college with mediocre grades, partying his way through the week, constantly calling home for more cash. And my parents always delivered. They drained their savings, they took out personal loans, they did whatever it took to keep the golden child shining. Meanwhile, I was working 70-hour weeks. I got my EMT certification. I started working at St. Catherine's Hospital. My salary wasn't huge, but I was proud of it. I was saving lives. I was pulling people out of mangled cars, performing CPR on the side of the highway, holding the hands of terrified patients in the back of an ambulance speeding through the city at 3 a.m. I was doing real, meaningful work. I thought maybe once I got a real career, my father would respect me. I remember coming to the house one Sunday afternoon in my uniform. I had just received a small promotion to a shift lead position. I stood in the kitchen, feeling a rare surge of pride, and told my parents the news. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper. A shift lead on an ambulance? What does that get you, an extra $1 an hour? Don't track mud on the floor. Your brother is coming over. 10 minutes later, Luke walked in. He was wearing a designer suit that my parents bought him. He casually mentioned that he had just received a promotion at the marketing firm where my father had pulled strings to get him hired. In reality, they just changed his job title to keep him from quitting, but my parents acted like he had just been named CEO of a Fortune 500 company. "We need to celebrate," my mother squealed. "Gerald, open the good champagne." "Oh, Luke, we are so proud of you." I stood in my EMT uniform, the uniform I had sweat and bled in to save actual human lives, and watched them pop champagne for a guy whose biggest accomplishment that week was figuring out how to use the coffee machine in the break room. I quietly walked out the back door. They didn't even notice I had left. The message was clear, burned into my brain over decades of psychological conditioning. Luke was the investment. I was the tax penalty. Luke was the future. I was the mistake they had to pay to keep breathing. I realized that I was never going to win their love. You can't negotiate with people who view you as a liability. So I stopped trying. I moved into a tiny, run-down apartment on the edge of town. I stopped going to family dinners. I focused on my job, my colleagues, and the small, quiet life I was building for myself. I thought I had successfully detached from the toxicity. I thought the worst they could do was ignore me. I was horribly, naively wrong. I didn't realize that my father's obsession with money and Luke's bottomless greed would eventually form a deadly combination that would put me directly in the crosshairs. Luke's lifestyle was expensive, and my father's plumbing business was struggling. They were running out of cash to fund the golden child's illusion of success. And when desperate, greedy people run out of money, they start looking for assets to liquidate. They just didn't realize that the asset they were going to target belonged to the only person in the family who actually loved me. The only sanctuary I had in my miserable childhood was a small, peeling white brick house on Elm Street. It belonged to my grandmother, Margaret. My grandmother was a tough, sharp-witted woman who saw right through my father's bullshit. She was my father's mother, but she rarely spoke to him. She knew exactly how he treated me, and she spent her entire life trying to shield me from the worst of his cruelty. Her house smelled like dried lavender and old books. Every Saturday, rain or shine, I would ride my beat-up bicycle to Elm Street. I would mow her lawn, clean out her gutters, and check her blood pressure with the cuff I bought from the pharmacy. In return, she gave me the only genuine affection I ever knew. She would make me black tea and sit with me on her creaky front porch swing. We would sit in silence for hours, just watching the cars go by. She didn't ask me about my grades to compare them to Luke's. She didn't look at my shoes and sigh about the cost. She just looked at me like I was a human being who mattered. "You have a good heart, Matthew," she told me once, her frail hand resting on my knee. "Not the physical one, the one inside your soul. Don't let your father turn it to ice." Near the end of her life, her health deteriorated rapidly. She was 84, her hands shook constantly, and her memory faded in and out. I visited her every single day before my night shifts, making sure she ate, giving her her medication. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, about a month before she passed away, I was sitting by her bedside holding her hand. The room was dark, the sound of rain tapping against the window pane. She squeezed my fingers with a sudden, surprising strength. Her eyes were sharp, perfectly clear, cutting through the fog of her illness. "Matthew, listen to me closely," she whispered, her voice raspy but firm. "Your father is a vulture. He is going to try to pick my bones clean when I'm gone. But I beat him to it." I leaned in, thinking she was hallucinating from the pain medication. "Grandma, it's okay. Just rest." "No, listen," she insisted, pulling me closer. "I've taken care of things for you. Only for you. When the time comes, a man named Sterling will find you. He's a lawyer. Trust him. Do not trust your father. Do not sign anything Gerald gives you." I brushed her thin white hair back from her forehead. "Okay, Grandma. I promise." I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed it was the rambling of a dying woman trying to find control in a situation she had none over. I assumed my father would inherit the house on Elm Street, sell it, and hand the cash directly to Luke. I had already made peace with it. A month later, Margaret died. I stood at her funeral in the pouring rain, watching them lower the casket into the ground. My father wore a tailored black suit, holding an umbrella over Luke and Eleanor. He didn't shed a single tear. He was already talking to a real estate agent on his phone before we even left the cemetery. I stood 20 feet away, soaking wet, mourning the only family member who ever cared if I lived or died. I thought the pain of losing her was the worst thing I would experience that year. I threw myself into my work. I took double shifts. I rode the ambulance through the darkest parts of the city, trying to outrun the grief. 3 months after the funeral, the universe decided I hadn't suffered enough. It was 4 a.m. on a Tuesday. I had just finished a brutal 12-hour overnight shift. We had responded to a domestic dispute, a heart attack, and a severe overdose. My body was exhausted. My eyes were heavy. I was driving my old, rattling Honda Civic through the empty city streets, just wanting to fall into my cheap mattress and sleep for a week. I approached the intersection of 5th and Main. The light was green. I accelerated through the intersection. I never saw the truck. A massive Ford F-150, driven by a guy who had fallen asleep at the wheel, blew through his red light doing 60 miles an hour. There was no time to brake. No time to swerve. There was only a blinding flash of high beams cutting through the darkness, filling my windshield with terrifying white light. Then the deafening crunch of metal. The violent, explosive force of the airbag deploying against my face. The shattering of safety glass raining down on my arms like ice. My car was thrown sideways, spinning wildly before slamming into a concrete light pole. The frame of my Civic folded inward like a crushed soda can, pinning me against the steering column. The last thing I remember was the sharp, metallic taste of copper in my mouth, the smell of burning rubber, and the agonizing realization that my chest, the chest that had already been cut open once to save my life, was being crushed. Then, everything went black. When you work in emergency medicine, you know exactly what a fatal crash scene looks like. You know the smell of antifreeze mixed with blood. You know the horrific, unnatural angles a human body bends into when it absorbs the kinetic energy of a 2-ton vehicle traveling at 60 miles an hour. If I had been awake when the fire department used the jaws of life to peel the roof off my car, I would have known my odds were near zero. I was rushed to St. Catherine's, my hospital. The EMTs in the back of the rig were my friends. They were doing chest compressions, shouting my name, pushing for fluids into my collapsing veins. They rolled me through the sliding glass doors of the ER, screaming for a trauma team. Dr. Eris, the surgeon who had patted me on the back in the cafeteria just a day prior, took one look at my crushed body and immediately ordered me into the operating room. I had severe internal hemorrhaging. My spleen was ruptured. 4 ribs were fractured, and my brain was swelling rapidly against my skull. They managed to stabilize me during the first emergency surgery, packing my abdomen to stop the bleeding, but the brain swelling was critical. They placed me in a medically induced coma in the ICU. To save my brain function, they needed to perform a secondary, highly complex craniotomy. And because I was unconscious and intubated, they needed a signature from my next of kin to proceed. They called my father. According to the official hospital incident report, Gerald arrived at 10:47 p.m. He walked through the automatic doors of the ICU wing. He didn't rush. He didn't look panicked. He walked with the slow, measured pace of a man going to a bank to dispute a late fee. He didn't go to my room first. He didn't look through the glass to see his son hooked up to a ventilator, a breathing tube shoved down my throat, my head wrapped in bloody bandages. He walked straight to the nursing station and demanded to speak to the billing department and the attending surgeon. Dr. Aris met him in the hallway. He laid out the grim reality. Your son has a severe traumatic brain injury. We need to operate immediately to relieve the pressure, or he will suffer irreversible brain death. The surgery and the subsequent ICU stay will be extensive. Gerald looked at the doctor. What's the financial damage? Dr. Aris, taken aback by the coldness of the question, gave him the estimate. Around $240,000. Insurance will cover a portion, but the out-of-pocket maximum will be significant. That was the exact moment my father decided I was dead. You see, what Dr. Aris didn't know, what nobody in that hospital knew, was that Gerald had recently acquired a massive sum of cash. $280,000 to be exact. And that money was already earmarked. It was meant to pay off Gerald's mounting gambling debts, and more importantly, it was meant to fund Luke's extravagant month-long vacation to Paris. Luke had already booked first-class flights, 5-star hotels overlooking the Seine, and Michelin-star restaurant reservations. If my father authorized my surgery, the hospital would eventually come after his assets to cover my medical debt. That meant the $280,000 he was sitting on would be at risk. It meant Luke would have to cancel his flights. It meant the golden child would be inconvenienced. Gerald looked at Dr. Aris and delivered the line that would forever alter the course of our lives. Let him go. We won't pay for the surgery. His heart has been defective since he was a kid anyway. Luke needs that money for Paris. He already booked the flights. Dr. Aris was stunned. Sir, I don't think you understand. Without this surgery, Matthew will die. Tonight. I understand perfectly, Gerald said, his voice steady, devoid of a single ounce of human emotion. Where is the paperwork? At exactly 11:08 p.m., my father signed a do not resuscitate order. He legally bound the hands of the surgeons who were standing by, scrubbed in, waiting to save my life. He handed the clipboard back to Dr. Aris. Then he stepped away from the desk, pulled out his phone, and made the call to my mother. The call that Paul, the head nurse, overheard. Eleanor, it's done. I signed the papers. The hospital won't touch the funds. Tell Luke his Paris trip is safe. The mortgage money stays in the account. I'll be home in 20. Gerald walked to the elevator. He didn't look back. He went home, crawled into his warm bed, and went to sleep, fully expecting that by the time he woke up, I would be a corpse in the hospital morgue. If the universe was truly cruel, that would have been the end. The monitors would have flatlined, the nurses would have drawn the curtain, and Gerald would have thrown a cheap funeral before driving Luke to the airport. But my father made a massive miscalculation. He assumed the hospital staff viewed me the same way he did, as a line item on a spreadsheet. He forgot that I worked there. He forgot that to the nurses and doctors at St. Catherine's, I wasn't a financial burden. I was Matthew. I was the guy who brought donuts to the night shift. I was the EMT who helped them lift heavy patients. I was their brother in the trenches. Paul, the head nurse on the ICU floor, was a veteran of the emergency ward. He had seen drug addicts, gang members, and murderers come through the doors. But he later told me he had never seen anything as purely, chillingly evil as my father standing in the hallway, prioritizing a luxury vacation over his own son's life. When Paul heard that phone call, a cold, blinding rage ignited in his chest. He watched my father step into the elevator, and then he looked through the glass at my broken body. The monitors were beeping steadily, but my blood pressure was dropping. Time was running out. Dr. Aris was sitting at the charting station, his head in his hands, furious but legally paralyzed by the DNR. Paul wasn't going to let me die. Not for a trip to Paris. Not for a monster like Gerald. Paul knew the rules. He knew that violating a DNR was grounds for immediate termination and the loss of his nursing license. He couldn't just walk into my room and start pushing meds. He needed a legal loophole. He needed a miracle. Instead of screaming or throwing a punch at the elevator doors, Paul did something infinitely smarter. He turned around, walked briskly to the hospital's human resources department, and used his senior access keycard to open the filing room. It was 11:20 p.m. The hospital administration wing was dark and silent. Paul turned on the fluorescent lights, his heart pounding in his chest. He went straight to the employee medical records cabinets. He yanked open the drawer labeled HM and furiously flipped through the thick manila folders until he found mine. Hayes Matthew. He slammed the folder onto a desk and began tearing through the papers. Vaccination records, physical exams, background checks. He was looking for one specific document. 3 years prior, when I first started riding the ambulance, we had a particularly gruesome week. We pulled 3 dead bodies out of car wrecks in a span of 4 days. It messes with your head. It makes you realize how fragile life is. After that week, the hospital administration required all frontline responders to update our emergency contacts and advance directives. I remembered sitting in the break room, staring at the blank line that said, Primary Healthcare Proxy/Emergency Contact. My pen hovered over the paper. I thought about my father. I thought about how he looked at me like a debt. I knew with absolute certainty that if I was ever incapacitated, I could not trust my parents with my life. So I didn't write Gerald's name. I didn't write Eleanor's name. I wrote the name of the only person in my life who had proven he would walk through fire for me. My best friend, David. David and I had been through EMT training together. We had shared an apartment. He knew my fears, he knew my family situation, and he knew that I wanted to live. Paul's finger traced down the pages until he stopped at a notarized document dated 3 years ago. Advance Healthcare Directive and Medical Power of Attorney. Appointed Agent, David Miller. Paul let out a sharp breath. The DNR my father signed was legally invalid. My father didn't have the medical power of attorney. David did. My father had just signed a useless piece of paper. But finding the document wasn't enough. The hospital legal department wouldn't accept it unless David was physically present to revoke the DNR and authorize the surgery in person, with a valid ID. Paul grabbed his phone and looked at the clock. 11:35 p.m. The weather outside had turned from a heavy rain into a torrential thunderstorm. Flash flood warnings were blaring on the hospital TVs. David lived in the neighboring county, a solid 90-minute drive away under normal conditions. And my brain was swelling by the minute. Paul dialed David's number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Paul dialed again, and again. On the 5th try, a groggy, sleep-heavy voice answered. Hello, David, it's Paul from St. Catherine's, Paul said, his voice hard and urgent. Matthew has been in a massive wreck. He's dying. His dad just signed a DNR to let him bleed out. You are his medical proxy. You need to get here right now, or he won't make it to sunrise. David later told me what happened on his end of the phone call. He was dead asleep in his apartment. When Paul said the words DNR and let him bleed out, David didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He dropped the phone, threw on a pair of sweatpants over his boxers, grabbed his keys, and sprinted out the door into the pouring rain. It was a nightmare drive. The thunderstorm was raging, turning the highway into a black, slick mirror. The wind was howling, pushing his old Jeep across the lanes. Visibility was practically zero. Sirens from fire trucks echoed in the distance, responding to localized flooding. A normal person would have pulled over. A normal person would have waited for the storm to pass. David pressed his foot to the floorboard and pushed the Jeep to 80 miles an hour. He hydroplaned twice, nearly spinning out into the concrete median. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He was screaming at the windshield, praying to a God he barely believed in to keep my heart beating just a little bit longer. Back at the hospital, the situation was degrading rapidly. The monitors in my room started blaring a frantic, high-pitched alarm. My intracranial pressure was spiking to critical levels. The nurses rushed in, preparing to push emergency meds, but Dr. Aris stood in the doorway, agonizingly restricted by the clipboard bearing my father's signature. "Where is this proxy, Paul?" Dr. Aris demanded, looking at the clock. It was 12:40 a.m. "If we don't drill into his skull in the next 20 minutes, it won't matter if we do the surgery. He'll be brain dead." "He's coming," Paul insisted, pacing the hallway. "He's coming." At 12:51 a.m., the automatic sliding doors of the emergency room exploded open. David burst through the entrance. He was completely soaked to the bone, water pouring off his clothes, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He didn't stop at the triage desk. He sprinted past the security guards, his boots squeaking wildly on the linoleum floor, and charged straight into the ICU wing. "Where is he?" David roared, his voice echoing down the quiet corridor. Paul ran up to him, grabbing him by the shoulders. "David, here." David marched up to the nursing station. Dr. Aris was standing there with the clipboard. David reached into his soaked pocket, pulled out his wallet, and slammed his driver's license onto the counter with a loud crack. "My name is David Miller," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and absolute fury. "I am Matthew Hayes's legally appointed medical proxy. I am officially revoking Gerald Hayes's do not resuscitate order, effective immediately. Do whatever you have to do to save my best friend. Now." Dr. Aris looked at the ID. He looked at the legal document Paul had pulled from the files. A massive wave of relief washed over the surgeon's face. He grabbed a pen, slashed a thick black line through my father's signature, and wrote void across the DNR. "Prep or 3. Move him now," Dr. Aris shouted. Within seconds, the ICU erupted into organized chaos. Nurses unhooked my bed from the wall monitors, slammed 4 bags onto portable poles, and sprinted down the hallway, pushing my bed toward the surgical wing. David stood in the hallway, dripping wet, watching them wheel me away through the double doors. He collapsed into a plastic waiting room chair, put his head between his knees, and finally let himself breathe. While the surgical team was drilling into my skull to relieve the pressure, saving my cognitive function and my life, my father was miles away, sleeping soundly in his warm bed. He was dreaming of Paris. He was dreaming of the money he had saved. He had no idea that a guy in wet sweatpants had just destroyed his perfect plan. The surgery took 6 hours. It was brutal. They had to remove a piece of my skull, repair the bleeding vessels, and piece me back together. But my heart, the defective heart that my father hated so much, kept beating. It refused to stop. I was wheeled back into the ICU just as the sun was coming up. I was heavily sedated, completely unaware of the war that had just been fought over my life. I remained in that dark, dreamless void for 3 long weeks, my body slowly repairing the devastating damage of the crash. And when I finally opened my eyes, the world I woke up to was entirely different. The illusions were gone. The hope of ever having a real family was dead. All that was left was the cold, hard truth, and a burning desire to balance the scales. Waking up from a 3-week coma isn't like the movies. You don't just open your eyes, stretch, and ask what year it is. It is a slow, agonizing crawl out of a suffocating darkness. The first thing I felt was the searing pain in my chest and the heavy, throbbing ache in my skull. Then came the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights piercing through my eyelids. I tried to swallow, but my throat was raw and scraped from the breathing tube that had been removed days prior. I blinked against the light. The blurry shapes in the room slowly sharpened into focus. I was in a private room, The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound. Sitting in a chair next to my bed, his head resting on his arms, was David. Standing near the window, checking my foredrip, was Paul. I made a dry, raspy sound. Water. David's head snapped up. His eyes went wide. He jumped out of the chair, nearly knocking it over, and grabbed a small sponge cup. Paul rushed to my other side, his face breaking into a massive, exhausted grin. "Welcome back to the land of the living, buddy," Paul whispered. Over the next 2 days, my cognitive functions slowly returned. I went through endless neurological checks, physical therapy assessments, and pain management adjustments. Through it all, David and Paul never left my side. But there was a glaring absence in the room, an absence I felt in the pit of my stomach. "Where are they?" I finally asked on the 3rd day, my voice still a hoarse whisper. "My parents. Luke." David looked at Paul. Paul looked down at the floor. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy, thick with a terrible tension. Paul walked over to the door, closed it, and locked it. He pulled the blinds down over the glass window. He walked back to my bed, holding a manila folder. His face was dead serious. "Matt, you need to listen to me very carefully," Paul said, pulling a chair up close to the bed. "You are safe. You are going to recover. But you need to know what happened the night you were brought in." For the next 20 minutes, in the quiet isolation of that hospital room, Paul and David methodically laid out the truth. They told me about the accident. They told me about the catastrophic brain swelling. And then Paul handed me a piece of paper. It was a photocopy of the official hospital incident report. I stared at the black ink on the page. My eyes scanned over the clinical, detached language. Attending, Dr. Eris. Next of kin, Gerald Hayes. Patient required emergent secondary craniotomy. Estimated cost, $240,000. Next of kin refused financial authorization. Next of kin executed do not resuscitate order at 2308. And there, in the notes section, Paul had documented the exact words my father had spoken in the hallway, and the exact words of the phone call he had overheard. "Let him go. We won't pay for the surgery. Luke needs that money for Paris. He already booked the flights." I stared at the words until they blurred. My hands began to shake. The monitor next to my bed started beeping faster as my heart rate spiked. My father didn't just refuse the surgery because he couldn't afford it. He refused it because he had the money, but he preferred to spend it on a luxury vacation for my brother. My life was weighed against a trip to France, and my life lost. And my mother, the woman who carried me for 9 months, was on the other end of that phone line, agreeing to it. They were going to let me suffocate on my own blood so Luke could eat escargot. A single hot tear rolled down my cheek and dropped onto the hospital gown. It was a tear of profound, shattering grief. It was the death of the little boy who used to mow lawns hoping his dad would smile at him. It was the death of every excuse I had ever made for them. David put his hand on my shoulder. "Matt, I'm so sorry." I took a deep, shuddering breath. The grief only lasted for a moment. Then it hardened. The sadness calcified into a cold, unbreakable block of pure ice in my chest. I wiped the tear away with the back of my bruised hand. I looked up at the ceiling, feeling a strange, terrifying sense of clarity. I didn't owe them anything anymore. The social contract of family was broken, burned to ash by a DNR order. They wanted me dead for profit. Fine. I was going to show them exactly what happens when the dead son wakes up. "Paul," I said, my voice no longer a whisper. It was steady. It was dangerous. "Get me my phone." Paul handed me my cell phone from the plastic belongings bag. I had 32 missed calls. None of them were from my parents. They were all from work colleagues and my landlord. I didn't call my father. I didn't call my mother to scream at her. Emotion makes you stupid. Anger makes you reckless. I needed to be surgical. I opened my contacts and scrolled past the family numbers. I stopped at a contact I had saved months ago but never used. A name my grandmother Margaret had whispered to me on her deathbed. Lawyer Sterling. I pressed dial. The phone rang twice before a deep, measured voice answered. Law offices of Arthur Sterling. This is Sterling. Mr. Sterling, my name is Matthew Hayes. Margaret Hayes was my grandmother. There was a pause on the line, then a shift in his tone. Matthew, I have been trying to reach you for nearly 4 months. I sent 3 registered letters to your parents' address, but they were all returned marked addressee unknown, moved out of state. I closed my eyes. My father intercepted them. Mr. Sterling, I was in a severe car accident. I've been in a coma for 3 weeks. I just woke up. My grandmother told me that before she died, she took care of things for me. What did she mean? Your grandmother, Sterling said, his voice dropping into a serious, confidential register, came into my office 2 years ago to draft a private, ironclad will. She explicitly cut your father, Gerald, out of her estate entirely. She left the deed to the house on Elm Street, fully paid off, and a trust account containing $85,000, solely to you, Matthew. The deed was recorded in your name the day after her funeral. My breath caught in my throat. Margaret, even in death, she was protecting me. She gave me a house. She gave me safety. But Sterling wasn't finished. However, Matthew, we have a massive problem, Sterling continued, the sound of keyboard clacking echoing over the phone. When you didn't respond to my letters, I ran a routine check on the property records last week. 3 weeks ago, while you were allegedly in this coma, a quitclaim deed was filed with the county. It transferred the ownership of the Elm Street house from your name into Gerald Hayes's name. What? I gasped, sitting up slightly, wincing at the pain in my ribs. I didn't sign anything. I was unconscious. I know, Sterling said grimly. The signature was completely forged. But it gets worse. 2 days after the fraudulent deed was filed, Gerald took out a massive home equity loan against the property. He mortgaged your grandmother's house for $280,000. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my brain with sickening force. The $280,000. The money my father was protecting at the hospital. My father was drowning in gambling debts. Luke wanted to go to Paris. They didn't have the cash. So, when I got hit by that truck and slipped into a coma, my father didn't pray for my recovery. He saw an opportunity. He broke into my apartment, stole my old medical consent forms to trace my handwriting, and forged my signature to steal my grandmother's house. How did he get it notarized? I asked, my blood boiling. The notary stamp belongs to a man named Wyatt, Sterling said. Wyatt. I knew that name. He was a guy from my father's church. He had gone through a brutal, messy divorce a year ago, and my father had supposedly loaned him money to pay his legal fees to fight for custody. Wyatt owed my father a massive favor. He stamped a forged document without me being in the room to pay off his debt. And then Gerald took that stolen money, paid his bookie, and handed the rest to Luke to book first-class tickets to France. When the hospital demanded $240,000 to save my life, it would have wiped out the stolen money. The bank would have put a lien on the house. The Paris trip would have been cancelled. So, my father chose to kill me to protect his stolen loot and his favorite son's vacation. Matthew, Sterling asked, his voice sharp, this is felony fraud, forgery, and grand larceny. Do you want me to notify the police? I looked at David and Paul. I looked at the hospital walls. I thought about the fear I felt when I was 6 years old, being told I was a burden. I thought about the Porsche in the driveway. Not yet, I said, my voice cold and hard as steel. If we just call the cops, he'll hire a lawyer and drag it out in court. He'll play the victim. I want to destroy him completely. I want to take his reputation, his money, and his pride all at once. And I know exactly where to do it. I looked at the calendar on the wall. Sunday. We do this on Sunday. Sunday morning arrived with a crisp, clear blue sky. It was the kind of perfect, peaceful morning that masked the absolute storm I was about to unleash. I was discharged from St. Catherine's on Friday. My chest still ached with every breath, and my ribs were wrapped tight, but my mind had never been sharper. I didn't tell my parents I was awake. let alone discharged. David picked me up in his Jeep. We spent Saturday at his kitchen table with Mr. Sterling, drinking black coffee and going over a stack of legal documents that were about to serve as my father's execution papers. We had the original will. We had the police report for felony fraud and forgery. We had the official injunction from a judge freezing the fraudulently obtained mortgage funds. And we had the hospital incident report detailing exactly why my father had signed my life away. My father was a deacon at First Grace Community Church. It was a beautiful old building with towering stained glass windows and heavy oak pews. For 15 years, Gerald had built his entire reputation inside those walls. He was the guy who organized the men's breakfast. He was the guy who shook everyone's hand at the door. To the congregation, he was a pillar of morality. Every first Sunday of the month, the church held a community gathering after the main service. The pastor would open the floor for members to share testimonies, offer prayers, or give thanks. David parked his Jeep down the street. We sat in the vehicle, watching the congregation filter into the fellowship hall. My heart hammered against my bruised ribs. I wasn't scared. I was vibrating with a cold, righteous anticipation. Mr. Sterling pulled up behind us in a sleek black sedan. He stepped out, wearing a sharp gray suit, holding a thick leather briefcase. He looked like a man walking to a firing squad to give the final order. He gave me a single, curt nod. It was time. We walked through the side entrance of the church, slipping into the shadows near the back of the fellowship hall. There were about 120 people sitting in folding chairs. The room smelled like stale coffee and cheap pastries. Up at the front, standing behind a wooden podium with a microphone, was my father. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime. His voice was thick with fake emotion, and his shoulders were slumped as if he carried the weight of the world. My mother, Eleanor, sat in the front row, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue. These past 3 weeks have tested my faith like nothing else, my father said into the microphone, his voice echoing through the silent room. As many of you know, my youngest son, Matthew, was in a terrible accident. He has been in a coma. The doctors told us to prepare for the worst. He paused, letting out a shaky breath. Several women in the audience murmured in sympathy. I haven't left his side, Gerald continued, wiping a non-existent tear from his cheek. I have sat by that hospital bed every single night, holding his hand, praying to the Lord to spare my boy. It has drained me. It has broken my heart to see him suffer. But family is everything. You never give up on family. The hypocrisy was so thick I could practically choke on it. He didn't sit by my bed. He didn't hold my hand. He walked in, asked about the bill, signed my death warrant, and went home to protect Luke's vacation money. The congregation broke into warm, genuine applause. Pastor Miller stepped up and placed a comforting hand on my father's shoulder. It was the perfect picture of a grieving, devoted father. I stepped out of the shadows. That's a beautiful story, Dad, I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the room like a gunshot. The applause died instantly. 120 heads snapped toward the back of the hall. My father froze. His hands gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned white. His face drained of all color, shifting from a rosy pink to a sickly, pale gray in less than a second. My mother dropped her tissue. I walked slowly down the center aisle. Every eye was on me. I was wearing a simple button-down shirt, but the thick medical bandages wrapping my head were clearly visible. I looked exactly like a man who had just crawled out of a grave. Matthew, Pastor Miller breathed out, stepping forward. My goodness, it's a miracle. You're awake. I am, I said, stopping a few feet from the podium. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes. Can I say a few words? Gerald didn't move. He couldn't. He was trapped. In front of his entire community, the people he had just lied to, he had no choice. He slowly, mechanically handed me the microphone. His hand was trembling violently. I took the microphone. I didn't look at the crowd. I kept my eyes locked on Gerald. Thank you all for your prayers, I started, my voice completely steady. I am incredibly lucky to be standing here. But I need to correct a few things my father just told you. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. My father wasn't sitting by my bedside, I said. He was at the hospital exactly once. The night of the crash. He didn't go to my room. He went to the billing department. He asked how much the surgery to save my life would cost. I pulled the folded hospital incident report from my pocket. I opened it slowly. When the surgeon told him the price, my father refused to pay. And these are his exact words, documented by the hospital staff. I brought the paper up and read clearly into the microphone. Let him go. We won't pay for the surgery. His heart has been defective since he was a kid anyway. Luke needs that money for Paris. He already booked the flights. A sharp collective gasp ripped through the room. Mrs. Higgins, an elderly woman in the second row, covered her mouth with both hands. Then, I continued. He signed a do not resuscitate order. He signed a paper to let me suffocate to death, so my older brother wouldn't have to cancel his luxury vacation. Matthew, please. My mother pleaded from the front row, her voice cracking. This is a private family matter. Don't do this here. You lost the right to privacy when you agreed to let me die, Eleanor. I snapped back, not even looking at her. My father finally found his voice. It was weak and frantic. He's confused. The brain injury, he doesn't know what he's saying. I was protecting the family. The heavy wooden doors at the side of the hall swung open. Mr. Sterling walked in. His leather shoes clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. He walked right up to the front, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. He is not confused, Mr. Hayes, Sterling said, his deep voice carrying authority. My name is Arthur Sterling. I am the attorney for the late Margaret Hayes. My father looked at the lawyer, and for the first time in my life, I saw the arrogant, cruel man completely break. He took a step back, bumping into the wall. Margaret Hayes left her home and her savings entirely to Matthew, Sterling announced to the stunned congregation. She explicitly cut Gerald out of her will. But while Matthew was in a coma fighting for his life, Gerald Hayes forged his son's signature on a quitclaim deed. Sterling opened his briefcase. He pulled out the original will and the forged property deed, holding them up. He stole his son's inheritance, Sterling continued, transferred the house into his own name, and took out a $280,000 mortgage to pay off his gambling debts and fund his eldest son's extravagant lifestyle. The notary who stamped this forged document is sitting right there in the third row. Sterling pointed a long finger directly at Wyatt. Wyatt went completely pale, shrinking down into his folding chair as people around him physically recoiled. Wyatt had sold his soul to pay for his messy divorce and custody battle, and now his world was crashing down too. Here is what happens now, Dad, I said, stepping closer to him, lowering the microphone so only the front rows could hear the pure ice in my words. Mr. Sterling filed an injunction yesterday. The bank has frozen the loan. The money you stole is locked. And I filed a police report on Friday. Felony fraud, grand larceny, and forgery. My father's chest was heaving. Sweat dripped down his face. You would send your own father to jail? Your own blood. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but a hollow, satisfied finality. You signed a paper to let your own son die, I said quietly. I'm giving you a chance to face the consequences and make it right. That's a lot more mercy than you ever gave me. I handed the microphone back to the pastor, who was staring at my father with utter disgust. I turned around and walked down the center aisle. Mr. Sterling followed right behind me. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. The silence in that church was louder than any explosion. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment one below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. The fallout was immediate, brutal, and incredibly satisfying to watch from a distance. When you strike at a narcissist's foundation, the collapse doesn't happen in slow motion. It happens all at once. By Monday morning, less than 24 hours after the confrontation at the church, my father's carefully constructed world was entirely reduced to ash. The bank acted swiftly. Because the mortgage was secured through a fraudulent deed, it was a federal offense. They didn't just freeze the remaining balance of the loan. They initiated a total lockdown on every single financial account tied to Gerald Hayes. And because my father had immediately transferred a massive chunk of that stolen money into Luke's checking account to pay for the Paris trip, Luke's finances were caught in the crossfire. I later heard the story from a mutual acquaintance about what happened to Luke at the airport. Luke had packed his designer suitcases. He had posted 3 different photos on his social media accounts, bragging about his upcoming first-class flight to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris. He arrived at the international terminal on Monday afternoon, wearing expensive sunglasses indoors, acting like he owned the place. He walked up to the priority check-in counter and handed the agent his passport and his platinum credit card to cover the oversized baggage fees. The agent swiped the card. It declined. Luke laughed it off, assuming it was a bank error. He pulled out his debit card, the one linked directly to the account holding the stolen mortgage money. The agent swiped it. The terminal beeped a harsh, angry red light. "I'm sorry, sir," the ticketing agent said. "This card has been flagged by your bank. The account is completely frozen under a fraud investigation lock. Your ticket has also been invalidated because the original purchase payment was reversed." Luke threw a massive tantrum right there in the terminal. He screamed at the agent. He demanded to speak to a manager. He called my father repeatedly, but my father's phone was sitting on an evidence table at the local police precinct. Security eventually had to escort Luke out of the airport. He stood on the curb, dragging his designer luggage, frantically trying to order a rideshare, but the app wouldn't accept his locked cards. He had to take the public bus home. And that wasn't even the worst of it for the golden child. 2 days later, a repo truck backed into my parents' driveway. The finance company that held the title to Luke's shiny red Porsche had been notified of the fraud investigation. Since the car payments were tied to the frozen accounts, they didn't waste any time. Luke stood on the lawn, screaming and crying, watching the tow truck drag his ultimate status symbol down the street. As for my father, the church board held an emergency meeting on Sunday night. They stripped him of his position as a deacon by a unanimous vote. Wyatt, the notary who stamped the fake papers, was arrested at his office on Tuesday. To save himself, Wyatt immediately flipped and gave the police a full confession, detailing exactly how my father had bribed him and brought him the forged documents while I was lying in a coma. Gerald's plumbing business evaporated overnight. In a small community, word travels fast. Nobody wants a man who would kill his own son to fix their pipes. His clients canceled their contracts. His suppliers demanded upfront cash he didn't have. I watched it all happen from the quiet safety of David's guest room. I didn't feel sorry for them. I felt a strange, profound sense of peace. The universe was finally balancing the ledger. But there was one final loose end. One last piece of the toxic puzzle I needed to understand before I could completely walk away. On Thursday evening, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number, but I recognized the local area code. I answered it. "Matthew?" It was my mother, Eleanor. Her voice was trembling, thick with tears. She sounded exhausted and small. "What do you want, Eleanor?" I asked coldly. "Matthew, please. You have to stop this," she sobbed into the receiver. "The police were here. They took your father's computer. The bank is foreclosing on our house to cover the stolen funds. We have nothing. Luke is devastated. He lost his car, his trip. He's severely depressed. You're destroying our family. Even now, even after everything, her primary concern was Luke's depression over losing a car and a vacation. My near-death experience didn't even register on her radar. "I didn't forge the signatures, Eleanor," I replied. "I didn't take out the loan. And I certainly didn't sign a DNR. Gerald did that to himself. He was just panicked, she cried, her voice rising in pitch, shifting from sadness to defensive anger. It was the same manipulative tactic she had used my entire childhood. We were all panicked. You don't understand the pressure we were under. The gambling debts were going to ruin us. And Luke had worked so hard he needed that break in Paris. We just needed the money situation handled quietly. I narrowed my eyes. I pressed the record button on my phone screen. Handled quietly? I repeated. What exactly does that mean? Eleanor was so caught up in her own victimhood, so desperate to justify their actions, that she didn't realize she was walking right off a cliff. The hospital was going to take everything, she yelled, losing her composure. If they did that surgery, the medical liens would have tied up your grandmother's house in probate for years. The loan money would have been seized. Luke and we told Gerald he had to make a hard choice. We told him to just let you go peacefully so the funds wouldn't be locked up. It was the logical thing to do. You were practically dead anyway. The silence on my end of the line was absolute. She had just confessed. It wasn't just my father. It wasn't just Gerald making a split-second greedy decision in a hospital hallway. My mother and my brother had sat at their kitchen table, knowing I was bleeding out, and they actively encouraged my father to pull the plug so they could cash out my inheritance. They were all in on it. They were all murderers in their hearts. Thank you, Eleanor, I said softly. Thank you? For what? She asked, confused, her anger suddenly faltering. For proving me right, I said, and for giving me the exact audio recording I need to hand over to the prosecutor tomorrow morning to ensure conspiracy charges are added to Gerald's indictment. And possibly yours. Matthew, wait. I ended the call. I went into my phone settings and blocked her number. I blocked Luke's number. I blocked every single relative who had ever attended one of their family barbecues. I was done. The surgical extraction of the cancer in my life was complete. There was nothing left for them to take from me, and there was nothing left for me to say to them. 3 months later, the dust finally settled. The legal gears grind slowly, but when they have irrefutable proof, they grind exceedingly fine. Gerald took a plea deal to avoid a 10-year prison sentence. He pleaded guilty to felony forgery, grand larceny, and fraud. Because it was a non-violent financial crime and his first offense, the judge gave him 5 years of strict probation, but mandated full and immediate restitution. To pay back the bank for the stolen $280,000, my parents were forced to sell their house. The house I grew up in, the house where I was constantly reminded of my worthlessness, was auctioned off. They had to liquidate everything. The furniture, Eleanor's jewelry, my father's remaining plumbing equipment. They were left with absolutely nothing. They moved into a cramped, miserable one-bedroom apartment in a bad part of town. Luke, the golden child, the boy who was supposed to conquer the business world, was suddenly cut off from his endless supply of parental cash. Without his fancy car and his designer clothes, the illusion shattered. He lost his fake job at the marketing firm because my father could no longer bribe the owner. The last I heard, Luke had taken a job working sanitation for the city, hauling garbage cans at 4 in the morning to pay off his massive credit card debts. I didn't gloat. I didn't drive by their new apartment to laugh at them. I simply let them fade into the background noise of the city, irrelevant and powerless, because I had a new life to build. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early October when Mr. Sterling called me into his office. He slid a heavy manila folder across his mahogany desk. Inside was a fresh, crisp property deed with the county seal stamped in the corner. "The fraudulent mortgage has been cleared," Sterling said, leaning back in his leather chair with a rare, faint smile. "The title is clean. The house on Elm Street is officially, permanently yours, Matthew, along with the trust account." I took the deed. My hands didn't shake. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. I drove straight to Elm Street. The autumn leaves were turning bright orange and gold, scattering across the small front lawn. The peeling white brick looked beautiful in the afternoon sun. I walked up the creaky wooden steps of the front porch. I pulled the brass key Sterling had given me from my pocket, slid it into the lock, and turned it. The heavy wooden door swung open. I stepped inside. The air was still, and the house was quiet. But immediately, I was hit by it. The smell of dried lavender. It was everywhere. Grandma Margaret had tucked small lavender sachets into the couch cushions, the curtains, the floorboards. The scent wrapped around me like a warm, familiar hug. It was the scent of the only woman who had ever truly planned for my future. I walked into the living room and sat down in her old rocking chair. I didn't turn on the lights. I just sat in the quiet shadows, looking at the dust motes dancing in the beams of sunlight filtering through the window. For the first time in my entire 29 years of existence, I was sitting in a house that belonged to me. A house where nobody was going to yell at me for tracking mud on the floor. A house where I didn't have to earn my right to exist by washing dishes or staying invisible. I was safe. I walked into Margaret's bedroom to open the windows and let some fresh air in. As I pulled open the top drawer of her oak dresser to put away some of my clothes, I saw a small, sealed envelope resting on top of a stack of old handkerchiefs. My name was written on the front in Margaret's shaky, spidery handwriting. I sat on the edge of the bed and carefully tore the envelope open. Inside was a single piece of lined notebook paper. My dearest Matthew, if you are reading this, it means that Vulture Gerald tried to take what is yours, and Mr. Sterling did his job. I am sorry I couldn't be there to protect you from the storm, but I needed you to have this house, not just for shelter but as a reminder. Your father is a broken man who only understands the language of money. Do not let him teach you that language. You have a beautiful, strong heart. You save people for a living. You are worth more than all the gold in the world. Do not carry their guilt anymore. You owe them nothing. Build a life full of light, Matthew, and lock the door behind you. All my love, Grandma. I folded the letter, pressed it against my chest, right over the scar on my sternum, and finally I cried. Not tears of grief for the family I lost, but tears of pure, unadulterated relief. The heavy, suffocating chain that had been wrapped around my neck since I was 4 years old finally snapped. I was free. That weekend, I hosted my very first dinner party at the Elm Street house. I didn't invite relatives. I invited my real family. David came over early, carrying 2 massive bags of groceries and a 6-pack of decent beer. Paul showed up an hour later, bringing his famous homemade lasagna. Even Mr. Sterling accepted the invitation, arriving right on time with a bottle of expensive red wine and a rare, genuine smile. We sat around Margaret's old wooden dining table. The house was filled with laughter, the smell of garlic and baked cheese, and the warmth of good company. David told embarrassing stories about our EMT training days. Paul joked about the chaotic night shifts at the hospital. Sterling, surprisingly, had a wicked, dry sense of humor and told us stories about his days in law school. I looked around that table watching these 3 men. David, the friend who drove through a hurricane to save my life. Paul, the nurse who risked his career to find the legal loophole that kept me breathing. Sterling, the lawyer who executed my grandmother's final wish with absolute precision. Blood doesn't make a family. Loyalty, sacrifice, and unconditional support make a family. I had spent my whole life begging for scraps of affection from a table where I was never welcome, when all along, I had the power to build my own table. We raised our glasses. To Margaret, Sterling said, holding up his wine. To Margaret, we all echoed. The clinking of the glasses was the best sound I had ever heard. The nightmare was over. The storm had passed, and the morning sun was shining brighter than it ever had before. It has been over a year since I walked out of that hospital and stood up in that church. A lot has changed. I took the $85,000 from the trust account and used a portion of it to go back to school. I didn't want to just be an EMT anymore. I wanted to do more. I'm currently finishing my degree to become a registered trauma nurse. I want to be the guy standing in the emergency room, the guy who looks at a broken patient coming through the doors and says, "We are going to do everything we can to save you," regardless of what a piece of paper or a price tag says. I still live in the house on Elm Street. I planted a new garden in the backyard, full of lavender, just the way Margaret liked it. I framed her letter and hung it in the hallway, right by the front door, so I see it every time I leave for a shift. Sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet, I think about that hospital room. I think about the beep of the monitor, the coldness of the 4-line, and the terrifying realization that my father was perfectly willing to let me die. People often ask me if I forgive them. Society puts a lot of pressure on victims of family abuse to forgive and forget, claiming that holding on to anger is like drinking poison. They say things like, "But they're still your parents," or "You only get one family." I think that's a dangerous lie. Forgiveness is a beautiful concept, but it requires the offending party to acknowledge their wrongdoing and actively seek redemption. My parents never did. They were only sorry that they got caught. They were only sorry that they lost their money and their house. They were never sorry for viewing my life as a disposable asset. So no, I don't forgive them, and I don't feel guilty about it. I used to believe that being a good son meant absorbing whatever cruelty my family threw at me. I thought it meant taking the insults, taking the neglect, and saying thank you because they paid for my heart surgery when I was 4. I was conditioned to believe that setting a boundary was an act of betrayal. I was wrong. Setting a boundary isn't revenge. It is the purest form of survival. When someone shows you that they do not value your life, believe them the first time. You do not owe anyone your sanity. You do not owe anyone your financial security. And you absolutely do not owe anyone your life, not even the people who gave it to you. My grandmother Margaret taught me that. She didn't teach it with loud lectures or screaming matches. She taught it with quiet, calculated planning. She taught it with a hidden letter, a probated will, and a lawyer who didn't take any nonsense. She showed me that you have to protect yourself, because the wolves aren't always strangers hiding in the woods. Sometimes, the wolves are the people sitting across from you at the Thanksgiving table. If you take anything away from my story, let it be this: your worth is not determined by how much you cost or how much you earn or how useful you are to someone else's selfish agenda. Your worth is inherent. You deserve to be surrounded by people who would drive through a storm for you, not people who would sign your life away for a plane ticket. Walk away from the tables where respect is no longer being served. Build your own table. Find your own David, your own Paul. And never, ever let anyone make you feel like your existence is a burden. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It wasn't easy to revisit some of these memories, but knowing that there are people out there willing to listen makes a world of difference. I hope this resonated with you in some way. Family dynamics can be incredibly complicated, and sometimes the hardest battles we fight are against the people who share our last name. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic family member to save your own peace of mind? I read every single comment, and I would love to hear your experiences down below. Before you go, I have a quick request. If you've made it all the way to the end of this video, you are part of an exclusive group. You are part of what I call the 1% Club. I want you to drop the letter W in the comments section right now. W stands for winner. It's our secret code to recognize the people who have the patience, the empathy, and the attention span to sit through a real heavy story all the way to the final word. It lets me know exactly who the absolute best members of this community are. If my journey brought you any value, please hit that like button. It helps the algorithm show this video to other people who might need to hear this exact message today. And don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so we can continue navigating these crazy life stories together. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next one.